The forest was quiet. Too quiet. That was the first thing Jake noticed when he stepped out of the tent to build a fire. The air was filled with pre-dawn chill, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the thick pines, dawn was already beginning to break. But something was wrong. The birds, usually chirping at sunrise, were silent. Even the wind seemed to have hidden, not rustling a single branch. Jake felt a slight chill run down his spine, but he brushed the feeling aside. He was an experienced camper and knew that in the Canadian wilderness, there was always something that could give you goosebumps. But today, this something felt stronger. He and his friends, Emily, Mark, and Sarah, had come here 3 days ago to spend a week away from civilization. The place was perfect, a lake with crystal clear water, a dense forest full of wildlife, and not a soul around. They had set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, and from the first day, they had enjoyed the silence and peace. But now, the silence seemed ominous. Jake bent down to toss a few dry branches into the fire when he heard a rustling in the bushes. He straightened up sharply, his heart pounding. "Hey, who's there?" he called out, trying to sound confident. There was no answer. Jake slowly turned, scanning the forest. Nothing. Only trees, standing like silent guards. "Jake, what are you yelling about out there?" came a sleepy voice from the tent. It was Emily, his girlfriend. She peeked out, her brown hair tousled, her eyes still full of sleep. "Nothing," he replied, trying to reassure both himself and her. "I just thought I heard something." Emily yawned and disappeared back into the tent. Jake sighed and went back to the fire. But the unease didn't go away. He knew there were bears in these woods, and although he and his friends had taken all the precautions, storing food in special containers hung from a tree and trying not to leave any garbage behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. An hour later, the camp came to life. Mark, a tall, strong guy with a perpetual smile on his face, was cooking breakfast over the fire, and Sarah, his girlfriend, was helping him, laughing at his jokes. Emily sat on a log, sipping coffee, while Jake checked the gear. They were planning to hike to a lake a few kilometers from the camp today. "Hey Jake, did you hear something growling last night?" Mark asked, flipping the scrambled eggs in the pan. Jake frowned. "No, what about it?" "I don't know," Mark shrugged. "Maybe it was the wind." But the sound was strange. Like something big was prowling around. Jake felt the chill run down his spine again. "We should be alert," he said. "There are grizzlies in these woods." "Oh, come on," Sarah laughed. "We don't leave food around. They won't bother us." "I hope so," Jake muttered, but the unease remained. After breakfast, they packed their backpacks and set off on their hike. The forest was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the treetops, illuminating the moss beneath their feet. They walked, laughing and talking, enjoying nature. But Jake couldn't relax. He kept looking around, as if he felt someone was watching them. By noon, they had reached the lake. The water was cold, but they still decided to take a dip. After swimming, they had a picnic on the shore, enjoying the sun and the silence. But even here in this idyllic place, Jake couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. "You're kind of jumpy today," Emily remarked as they were packing up to head back to camp. "It's just..." Jake sighed. "I feel like someone's watching us." "A bear?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Maybe," he replied. "Just be careful." They returned to camp later in the evening. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They lit a fire and started cooking dinner. But they had barely sat down to eat when a loud crack came from the forest. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Jake replied, standing up. He took a flashlight and shone it towards the forest. The light picked out a few trees in the darkness, but nothing else. "Maybe it's a deer?" Mark suggested, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Deer don't make those kinds of noises," Jake said. "We need to be prepared for anything." They finished dinner in tense silence. After eating, they decided to go to bed early so they could go on another hike the next day. But Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in the tent, listening to every sound. The forest was quiet again, but this silence seemed ominous. He was already dozing off when he heard a new sound. This time, it was a low, deep growl that made his heart stop. He sat up sharply, waking Emily. "What's wrong?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She shook her head, but fear appeared in her eyes. At that moment, the growl repeated, this time louder and closer. Emily gripped Jake's arm. "It's a bear," she whispered. Jake quickly dressed and went out of the tent. Mark and Sarah were already standing by the fire, their faces pale. "It's a grizzly," Mark said, holding a hunting knife in his hand. It's somewhere nearby. Jake nodded. We need to be prepared. Grab anything that might help. They quickly gathered anything that could be used as a weapon, knives, an axe, even sticks. But they knew that against a grizzly, it wouldn't help much. The bear was huge, strong, and fast. If it decided to attack, they would have little chance. The growl sounded again, this time very close. Jake shone the flashlight into the forest, and his heart sank. In the flashlight's beam, he saw a huge shadow moving between the trees. It was the grizzly, and it was enormous. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, and its teeth were bared in a menacing snarl. Back up! Jake shouted, retreating towards the tents. Don't turn your backs on it. The bear emerged into the clearing. It was huge, its fur gleaming in the light of the flashlight. It stopped, sniffing the air, then slowly moved towards them. What do we do? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Stay together, Jake said. Don't run. If it attacks, hit it with everything you've got. The bear was approaching. Its breathing could be heard even from a distance. It stopped a few meters away from them, then rose on its hind legs. It was even bigger than they thought. Its head was higher than a human's, and its paws were the size of shovels. Oh God, Emily whispered. It's going to attack. Jake gripped the axe in his hands. He knew the chances were slim, but he wasn't going to give up. The bear dropped back down to all fours and took a step forward. At that moment, Mark threw a stick at it, trying to distract it. The bear growled, but didn't stop. Hey, get out of here! Jake shouted, waving the axe. Get away from here! The bear roared even louder, then lunged forward. Jake barely managed to jump aside as a huge paw flew past his head. He swung the axe at the bear, but it didn't even notice. The bear turned and hit Jake with its paw, sending him flying into the bushes. Emily screamed, throwing a rock at the bear. The bear turned to her, its eyes burning with rage. It took a step towards her, but at that moment Mark charged at it with a knife. He stabbed the bear in the side, but the knife barely pierced its thick hide. The bear roared and struck Mark with its paw, knocking him to the ground. Sarah grabbed the axe and hit the bear on the back. It growled, but didn't stop. It turned to her, and at that moment Jake, scrambling out of the bushes, charged at it again. He hit the bear on the head with the axe, and this time the bear recoiled. It roared, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Jake fell to his knees, gasping for breath. His body ached, but he was alive. Emily rushed to him, hugging him. Are you okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, he replied, although it wasn't entirely true. What about Mark? They ran to Mark, who was lying on the ground. He was conscious, but his arm was covered in blood. He hit me, Mark whispered. But I'm alive. Sarah was already getting out the first aid kit to bandage his wound. Jake looked around. The camp was destroyed, the tents were torn, things were scattered. But they were alive. We have to go, he said. It might come back. They quickly gathered everything they could and moved towards the road. The forest was dark and quiet, but they knew the bear was somewhere nearby. They walked in silence, listening to every sound. After a few hours, they reached the road where their car was waiting for them. We survived, Emily whispered as they got into the car. Yeah, Jake replied, but he knew that they would remember this day forever. The forest was beautiful, but it was also home to those who did not forgive mistakes. And they had just learned that firsthand.